Cuba and the U.S. have formally restored diplomatic relations after an agreement struck last year putting aside decades of hostility came into force. Just after midnight local time, the diplomatic missions of each country became full embassies. The Cuban flag was raised on Monday at the newly opened embassy in Washington. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is due to hold talks with his Cuban counterpart Bruno Rodriguez later in the day. Despite the historic shift, both sides admit to lingering difficulties. There were still issues that we don't see eye to eye on, a U.S. State Department spokesman said. A flag will not be raised at the American Embassy in Havana until Mr. Kerry pays a visit there on August 14. Outside of the embassy, crowds of people cheered as the Cuban national anthem played and 3 Cuban soldiers stood at attention while the flag was raised. Protesters dotted the crowd, and one was removed from the area by police. Mr. Obama's efforts to engage Cuba were partly held back by the country's imprisonment of U.S. Agency for International Development contractor Alan Gross, who was jailed for espionage charges. Secret negotiations led to Mr. Gross's release last year. Restrictions on Americans wanting to travel to Cuba remain in place, as does the wider U.S. trade embargo banning most American companies from doing business in Cuba. Cuba says the embargo, which it calls a blockade, is hugely damaging to its economy. President Raul Castro has urged President Barack Obama to lift it, calling it the main stumbling block towards normalizations. But the U.S. Congress would have to vote on the issue. The two presidents announced the move towards diplomatic ties in December last year. Conrad Tribble, Deputy Chief of Mission for the U.S. in Havana, tweeted, "Just made the first phone call to State Department Ops Center from United States Embassy Havana ever. It didn't exist in Jan 1961. He then shared the U.S. Cuban Embassy's new Twitter account, which already has more than 5,000 followers.